not sure how many is going to show up, but there was a track on how to run an open source project as a professional. I thought that was a little bit tempting. But I'm going to talk here a little bit about CRA, as you heard before, and what it means for the OSPO, the Open Source Program Office, or maybe in many places the Open Source Program Office, in organizations. So I'm Hans. I'm a sales guy. If you get the joke, you're supposed to say welcome. But down beneath, I'm also an old regular guy. I'm married to 2 teenage girls. That can put some pressure on people. And I also have a couple of dogs when I look for sanity in my life. My journey into the open source and open source compliance didn't start from me jumping out of high school and saying open source compliance, that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. There's many things happen in life by coincidence. I met a very good friend of mine who was just hired in by Black Dog Software back in 2008. I think Black Dog evolved around the 2002 when sort of open source licensing, open source compliance was involved at that time. And I got on that track at that time. I think as many other speakers have told, it was a different era at that time. I remember going out, some companies like, the likes of the Intel, the Disneys, the Ericsson, the Sony Mobile was a bit more mature in how they viewed the use of open source, not about the licensing, just the use of open source. But I had been in many calls or many meetings where you sit with CTOs or officers and say, we don't use open source. No, we don't use open source. We have a very strict policy, no open source around our developers. And as a salesperson, it is always quite difficult to get a meeting with people. And you sort of have experience that when you get a meeting with those companies, when you leave, they basically regret that they have had that meeting with me. Because we tend to give them a chance to give us a piece of your code, we'll scan it. We always found open source code. And the best for us selling compliance tool at that time, if we could find some GPL code in it. It sort of raised the bar of awareness. But that was sort of my journey into it. Since then I've been selling open source tools more in the security space. And lately I joined ScanOS back last year. And a little bit about ScanOS. It's a startup with about 30 people already. And have clients like AWS, Meta, Siemens, SAP. And what we offer is like we have a free open source scanner. So you can scan your code and find your security or whatever in there. And then we supply on a commercial basis, we provide data sets on open source licensing, on security, in open source, and also in cryptography, which is coming very soon in play, both in the CRA, but also in the post-mortem readiness. That, whether it's 10 years out or right now, that's the data. So before we dig into the CI, I thought give a little bit of the statistic. And the Linux Foundation, I think for the past 5 years, have run a survey where they sort of send out questionnaires to about 2,000 recipients, and I think half of them sort of qualified for the answers. And what they nicely do is they sort of, instead of reading the 40-page report, you can basically just download the illustration and the summary of that. So many companies today use open source. I think everybody uses open source, but they're also using another form of strategy, or even OSPOs. And I think the biggest problem when I speak to companies is that it's not about the developers, it's not about the middle layer of something, it's more the C-level. C-level don't really understand the open source, the implications on it, why it makes benefits, because there's tons of evidence that it makes a lot of benefits, even though you contribute to open source. As we heard before about curl, those contribute, you just move faster, the more you're transparent as a company, the more you use open source. It just gives more value to the company, far beyond that just showing that you can use open source. It's attract talents and many other very good positive things. Only 28% of the companies that were asked invest directly in sustainable open source. And only 62% report they were familiar with the CRA, which is some of the turning points. One of the other findings is that which of the following factors limit open source use and contribution to the organization. A little bit surprising to me, it's still around legal and license compliance matters. That is the top thing that they're concerned about. Because the use of RDRs, and I think if you ask Henrik, yes, it's complicated, but it's not something you can't unwiggle. It's just a matter, it's there. I didn't put in the licenses, Henrik didn't put in the licenses. The open source communities decided what licenses there is. And there might be a mistake on the picture we have today that there's way too many licenses. And I think there's about, well, at that time there was 2,500, and maybe today there are about 8,000 different licenses. It would have been far easier if there was just like 5. But it creates complexity, and that is where we are today. On the users lack of technical support, again, license concerns. And I think one thing that is a little bit funny, it doesn't mention anything about security. Those who asked did not mention security as a factor for not using or not going to uniform. Also a little bit surprising is that only 1/3 of the companies had a defined strategy using open source. 1/3. Here we are, 25 years later, 1/3 has it. And less than 1/4 had an OSPO. I think OSPO, when you sort of look for the OSPO, you know, I'm a sales guy, sorry about that. You use LinkedIn and nobody sort of really pops up on OSPOs unless you search for companies in Germany. They're very much transparent, it's OSPOs, but OSPO is not something that it comes up. But I think whether you only have 22% of OSPOs in your organizations, the function is there. It's just not narrowly defined on what does an open source officer or an office in that case. One OSPO that came and spoke to the kickoff we had at Scandus is Jose used to be open source program offices at Inditex. I know in Sweden everybody knows Henderson Horowitz, in Denmark everybody knows bestseller. In Spain it's Inditex. Inditex runs brands like CRA, and I think is one of the largest fashion companies in the world. And he was also had difficulties getting through to the C levels of the importance of OSPO. Because OSPO basically is the glue between the developers, the leaders, the community, the procurement, and all the other things that comes in. So it's sort of less infringements on using open source and make that journey more mature. But he says whether the OSPO is a signal for organization technology and maturity, and he says because the more technological mature an organization is, the more they understand using, contributing to, and managing open source software as a core process if the organization wants to remain competitive and also credible. So that is that clue we have in there on the OSPO. He wrote a blog, which you can find if you go on scanwest.com. He wrote a blog on which is based to highlight that day in OSPO. And he talks a little bit, it's a short blog, it's like 1 page. But he talks a little bit about what are the things that the OSPO do, where is the position in it, and it's definitely worth reading. So, S-bombs, back in my days we talked about bombs. In some areas you can't say bombs anymore, so we call it S-bombs. But it's sort of the narrative is that compliance teams request them, developers generate them, and you have security teams that follow them. But they always, the data itself often stay a little bit unknown. And I think if we're going to go from can you produce an S-bomb to explain what is in it, where does how is it built, and what control mechanism we have for continuously providing S-bomb on the CRA. So the CRA together with the OSPO is a much more vital part of the organization and narrative. So the CRA changed the questions and it forces organization into a new operating model on how handling this continuous reporting, continuously up to date on how we do it. So in the old model, we had like, it was a snapshot. It was before release date, and if you work in an organization that had been pushing for having an OSPO and S-bomb before you deliver, it was always a battle of who gets in line first, because there was there was a shortage on resources to run the SPOs for the compliance team. As it is right now, and how we build software today using containers, etc., is a dynamic. Cheat code continuously changes, and therefore we need more pragmatic and more new people to create these SPOs. So maturity means a repeatable control, evidence that survives both legal, customers, and regulatory scrutiny. Let me ask, how many of you have started on this CRA journey? Okay, so that's a good one. So there's also some that hasn't. You have great companies in Sweden, far bigger than the ones we have in Denmark. We have one good company in Denmark, that's Grundfos. Grundfos makes water pumps, and it's more famous for that, and one of the market leaders. They started the CRA journey more than a year ago, define processes, etc. And I spoke to Thomas Young, who's running that program within Grundfos. And me selling, again, simple sales guy, selling software, SBOM, it pushes button, it runs through, it scans, and it spits out the report. I say, yeah, that's fine, it looks logical. Grundfos has 1 million products. 1 million products. Creating SBOMs, 1 million products in a global organization with thousands or tens of thousands of developers included. That's complex. And my advice, and what he also says, is you better get started now than sooner than later, because it will build up a limit of time. And I think we heard all the speech this morning from the girl, is that more vulnerabilities will come into the code, and you need to fix them. And the more you build up that bottleneck for the end of 2027, the more you lay, the more shit you are. So I would advise that the sooner you get started with the CRA, the sooner you get started by defining those processes and have that defined line before. We always talk about snippets. A few vendors talk about snippets, like foss-ID, BlackDog, and also we talk about snippets. Snippets is not full components that you go in and identify. It's part of the open source components. And back in my old days, it was developers that would take out headers, and then you couldn't see what license was on it. You can sort of identify what the code is, and you can make a fingerprint of it, and you say, hey, this is actually a TPL, this code from this one. And it also allows you to look at modified code, it allows you to look into dependencies more deeply, and you also look into AI-generated code, because all AI-generated code comes from open source, or potentially proprietary code that you may have given to that machine. Because it doesn't sit and write code. It looks at pattern, it looks at what its good code looks like, etc. It comes from open source. And therefore you will see way more snippets coming in, which create way more work for a guy like Henrik. Because there will be more questions about snippets, dependencies, licenses, and also into security for that matter. And what also comes in is we talk about post-quantum readiness, it's also about cryptography. In the CRA, it says you need to secure your code in a state of art. The state of art means you start using cryptography to secure your code, when you talk about data keys. But you also need to prove that you have secured those for the regulatory, and that is good. So you need to know what cryptography has been in there, so now we also start talking about C-bombs. And I think Ollie, in his presentation, also mentioned about C-bombs, S-bombs, and so forth. Yeah, so again, SBOMs may be technical correct, but material incorrect. And the more we look into how we generate code today using containers, microservices, etc., it's a continuous exercise to run those, and you need to have that exercise implemented into your CI/CD. So from the day that code is started, the developers have the ability to scan the code, they have the ability to understand what code the AI generator may have created, what you have inherited from other developers, etc. You need to have that implemented into a smooth operation, otherwise this is never going to fly for It's not going to fly with you go to the compliance office and ask for an S-bomb and they'll produce it and you do it. And I think one of the issues that we also hear is that when you're a developer, you don't have necessarily written code yourself. It may have gone in from years back, and getting in to understand what code has come in, and the implication that has. So the good news is that open source compliance is possible, and it's also possible with open source tooling, which I guess will make well. So we have some. There might be more out there, but some of the more common tools out there is the open source review kit, very much used in the automotive. Especially, I'm not sure if the automotive in Germany. Foss-north has been around for many years. Foss-north or scanner and also around the OS dependency track that also looked into. So how we typically see the architecture, and when people come to us, we'll have a session and we'll talk through how your architecture, your tool set looks today and how we can fit it into that. But you have your code and build sources, you have your inspection scanners for control visualization, you have your ORT, you have pathology, and the outcomes is basically continuous S-bombs integrated into your CI/CD, you have C-bombs, release gates, guardrails, etc., etc. So I've just got like 3 slides showing you likely how this would look like in integration between scanner GitHubs and was dependency track. So integration is set with all major versions, system versions of systems. The policy is set to detect things like undeclared open source, like snippets, level matchings. It can be set on licenses, age of components, maturity of components, vulnerabilities, etc. Integrations provide also feedback and developers directly in their version control systems, whether it's GitHub, GitLab. And here you can go in and here you can actually see 2 types of policies that fails. One is undeclared license, and the other one is an S-bomb dependency track policy that has failed. So this is kind of how it would look like. And S-bombs are created through automation and viewable via the OS dependency track. I'm not quite sure if you're familiar with that, whether you're using it, but it can be done via there. And here again is different versions of the project that can be viewed and compared. Policies can be applied across one project, many projects. And it can be fine-tuned by whether the application is for distributed use, whether it's for SaaS use, internal use, a different setup. It all depends on the licenses, how you use it. And vulnerabilities and policies can be trashed here and have a full audit trail for all this displays. So the CRA doesn't really ask for perfection. It's more moving that you need to start getting ready. It's okay to know vulnerabilities, but you need to prove that you're doing something about it. You need to understand and prove that you can document that you are aware of something you weren't aware before. I think the speech this morning is that there will be constantly think there's no final point where everything is fixed. Of course you are generating more code and new code all the time, but there's no end game. It's a continuously phase that you need to clean up your code. You need to prove what is in there, both from the licenses, security matter, that you can both explain and also defend to the regulators. So I would say the new gold standard for OSPO is around explainability, about repeatability, and it's about variable control. Those are sort of the main 3 things I'm dealing with today. But on the CIA, on the OSPO, we need to define on what the role is there, how we can help. But the collaboration between the CIA lead in the company, the project lead, and the OSPO, how you're going to define that, how you're going to implement those processes, is rather review, I would say. That's it. Questions?
questions? Yep.
Hi Hans, thanks. I'm curious, how does observability relate to scanners and to the task of the OSPO?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we do at Scanners in the scanner is that we will help identify. So we can have a scanner. We have this one, and you can use other scanners. But the scanner will only identify what is there. And then you have other tools, whether using the dependency track or using OWASP or something, or OWASP or something, to map it out, do comparison and all that. So that's how it's set up.
So ScanOSS scans source code for SBOM to create SBOMs, if I understand correctly. You also mentioned cryptographically scanning.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a bit on that and how you could create CBOMs in that case? Like what's the input here?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I think the SBOM has been long, been away for a very long time, and the CBOMs is something we see rather new here, and it's something that is keep on learning right now. But it's kind of the same mechanism that you look for keys, you look for patterns in the code. So when we run a scan, we will identify matching up to the data sets we have. We will match both, and for the CBOM, we will match both cryptographic in open source, but also in proprietary. But the mechanism is kind of the same. You look for matches on your cryptographics.
Maybe I can do that. So the CBOMs, is that then to get an inventory of what kind of cryptographic algorithms you're using, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in the software. So there are many do like endpoint, what endpoint I'm using, what cryptographic we are there. But you want to make in and say there's certain levels of cryptography that we don't want to have right now because of the quantum, the post-quantum readiness that's coming up. And what we hear more now is like, what is the urgency of cryptography? What is the urgency of having that thing in? And I think what rest, we are still 5, 10, 15 years out maybe to create that quantum. There's always like breakpoints out, but before it's sort of become in a more mature manner of the mainstream of using cryptography. But what's happening right now is there's this harvest now on crypto data. So the bad people right now is harvesting data, who still decrypt data. So it is also an urgency that you at least know what's being used, or should we step off from a certain cryptographic to another cryptographic. So that's what the CBOM does.
Okay, that's all the time we have today. Thank you very much, Hans.
Thank you.